Thank you for joining Inside the CISO's Office today. I'm the producer, Lance Hart. Today, we'll be talking about navigating risks in the modern landscape. As always, I have the consulting CISO, John Bruggeman, and special guest, Tom Siu, virtual CISO from Inversion 6. John, let's jump right in.
Great. Thank you, Lance. I appreciate it. Good to see you, Tom. It's been a little while. I'm looking forward to talking about risk because one of the things that I try to help CFOs and CEOs understand when we talk about cybersecurity is the risk. But tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing these days.
Well, thanks, John, and thanks, Lance, for having me here. My name's Tom. I've been a CISO in higher education for almost 18 years. In the past 7 months, I've been a consulting CISO or virtual CISO with a firm called Trusted Internet, where I get to see a lot of different clients. So it's been a big change from running a large enterprise environments in cybersecurity to doing the whole soup to nuts for a specific client. I was so previously I was at Michigan State for almost 3 years, and then before that, 15 years just about at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. So those big research enterprises with a lot of risk that are taken. And it's interesting to be able to say, hey, here's the practices that we can, focus those in onto a particular client or a customer engagement. So that's what's been going on. It's pretty exciting to be in the cybersecurity field, even though people say there's all kinds of challenges. I like
opportunities. They're only opportunities, Tom. You know that. I know that.
Yeah, back in the Navy, we used to tell the midshipmen, "Here's an opportunity to excel."
There you go. I can imagine. So our first topic for today is going to be the interplay between cybersecurity risk and physical risk, and I think a lot of people don't consider that, particularly if they're not in the cybersecurity field, because they don't think, they think cybersecurity, it's only the computers and what could possibly happen. But if you go back to 2010 with Stuxnet, which is one of the first examples of a cybersecurity risk that was leveraged to impact a physical environment where a malware basically caused centrifuges in Iran to wobble and destroy themselves, essentially. So that's a clear example of how a cybersecurity risk, a malware can be introduced into a closed system and impact physical risk. What are some of the examples that you have from your experience back at either Case Western or at Michigan State in terms of the interplay between physical risk and cybersecurity risk?
Well, one particular thing to think about right off is that the ransomware world, starting in 2016, has really brought the question of not so much did I lose data I can continue operating while I prosecute this cybersecurity incident, to more of I've lost the access control to the systems. And if those are your cybersecurity and physical security monitoring or alarming or mass notification systems, you've really seen that overlap into the physical world. I think the particular case that I would bring forth as the best example is we had a ransomware at Michigan State before I got there, but I got to finish the incident response, and it took down a whole department for 5 to 6 months.
Wow.
That department was not operating. They had to rebuild all of their desktops. Of course, they had older machines that weren't going to take more modern operating systems, and it took an investment. We had to go find the money and staffing to go convert their Active Directory environments that had been taken over by the malware and attacking group. In a sense, we rebuilt those things clean from the baseline, but they were almost. It was during COVID, so it only added an extra layer of complexity to their response. But in particular, this department wasn't doing research for quite a while, and while we had to rebuild that environment. I think that's probably the key piece that sticks in my mind as a CISO is that every ransomware has now become much larger spread. We used to call it the Shamu splash zone. Those of you who have gone to see, Shamu at SeaWorld, the first 4 rows are in that zone. And
yes, the splash zone.
Sure,
yes.
So for sure, your risk or problem space is in the pool, But part of the show is some of that splashes out and gets the people in the front row. And some people choose to live in that risk zone. Others want to be way back up in the back, but then you don't see, you're not as close to, the show. So what I'm saying is CISOs now need to somehow get integrated with their physical emergency operations type of situations. And I think the second example is the COVID taught us all that. You had to think about your resilience of your own team, particularly if you or your staff or your key staff members were sick. And imagine you're one deep in some areas. How are you going to conduct those operations if that person just happens to be, have the flu even? Let alone a pandemic type of situation where there's not a well-known treatment regime. We don't know the efficacy of care, and we're taking guesses, actually, at sometimes the responses.
Do you feel that the cybersecurity teams that you've either helped build or have worked with more recently as a consulting CISO have improved the resiliency to either ransomware, or have the tools that we have available to us improved to help minimize the risk? Because I know I talk with customers all the time, and there's the concern about technology spread. I'm going to buy best of breed, so you have to buy 16 different tools to do all the controls that you want to implement, and now you've got 16 screens that you have to look at. And the phrase that I heard years ago was called the fog of more, which is a play on the fog of war. And I've seen some vendors approach the centralization of the tooling to get down to fewer screens. So there's fewer, things that you have to look at to be aware of. And so I feel like, particularly the customers I've helped, that we are getting better at, minimizing the sprawl of technology. But have you seen the same thing in your experience?
I don't necessarily see that.
Okay.
What I do see is IT departments and business units pursuing, almost channelized IT products and services. Let's take the example of Salesforce has gotten a better footprint in higher education as part of the customer relationship management, which should equate to anybody not in higher education as donors and alumni.
Yeah.
Okay, because anybody's got an email or a newsletter from their high school or their college, they know that alumni have a higher propensity to be donors to that case, which helps them build their endowment, which they can run operational funds from. Part of that is the key in that relationship building. But different vendor services have penetrated the market, and as a security person, you need to know kind of the pluses and minuses of each one. Sometimes different departments at the university will have different CRM systems.
Yeah.
A good example is like, oftentimes they will hire students to call out, and then you got a call system, and then you have to handle PCI with that. And where's that data resting? So you do need to at least have a handle on where that is. That's just one solution. Imagine 3 or 4. And then there's no one size rule that fits them all, other than if you can think strategically and say, here's the requirements. How are you going to solve that with each different vendor product? But I think you were actually more talking about cybersecurity vendor spread and services. Is
definitely.
That right?
Yeah. Although the thought that I had as we were talking about this topic was, and I mentioned Stuxnet early on, but for those that were out in Las Vegas when MGM got hit with their ransomware event, that had direct impacts to the real world. And from the reporting that I've read, MGM was hit with a ransomware event. They made the choice to not pay. Caesar's Palace also got hit with ransomware and chose to pay. And there were 2 different outcomes based on, we can go down a lot of different paths, but just keeping it in the context of the physical impact, the physical risk and the cybersecurity risk. I'm just curious if there are other thoughts on that topic before we move to the next one.
Well, you may want, it's a really interesting case because they're side by side, same industry, but different organizations for sure. The balance here is that you can make an economic argument that it was, a reasonable one to pay a ransom at a smaller amount. And the perpetrators of these want that. They want to say, hey, yeah, just pay my fee and maybe I'll give you the decryption keys. There's still that sort of question. But I think MGM took the high road, if you can say that's the case in casino gambling. And I agree that you shouldn't be paying ransom because it's still that somebody's paying the ransom. So that's funding the mechanism you're feeding the beast, so to speak. But it does show you a side-by-side comparison. Obviously, the two industries are slightly the two different casino groups, same industry, hotel, other services.
Entertainment,
entertainment for sure. And I think what that illustrates is that the hard decision of what I think I promote, you should not be paying ransom. That hard decision comes with a particular, hey, let's think of the consequences of that. The deeper piece is, despite some of the security controls that each of these organizations can put in place, someone could penetrate them, either with some insider help or there's just so much noise, especially if you've got consumers in your network. That's higher education, that's casinos, hotels. You go to a hotel. Retail. There's tons of retail in those environments. And some are loss leaders and some are profit gain margin places. Usually the casino is going to make the money. The hotel and the restaurants are not.
Yeah.
But they did their DR and BC planning so they could check people out manually. I'm sure they lost money, but what did people want to come back? But that remains to be seen because a year later was when people usually cycle back to their plans to go to Las Vegas.
Yeah, it'll be.
I grew up in Las Vegas, by the way.
I haven't been to Las Vegas recently. Have you?
Not since before COVID, but as mentioned, I grew up in Las Vegas. My mother worked for Caesar's Palace. I got to see a lot of the inside operations pre-internet days, obviously.
Yeah.
But a good deal of that is they're trying to prevent people from gaming the system, so to speak, and stealing money. If you saw some of the movies about people card counting and trying to find ways to steal money, they'll just invite you to leave. Well, can they just do that on the internet if they don't know?
Not at all.
It could be that.
Yeah.
So that actually is an interesting story. I guess if we wanted to talk about the fusion of cyber and physical safety and security, Las Vegas would be an interesting model to study.
I think it would be. But moving to our next topic, we've got strategies for identifying and prioritizing risks in today's dynamic landscape. And when you think about that, did you have a particular strategy for identifying and prioritizing risk, or did you just go, hey, I'm going to protect the crown jewels, I'll put all my controls against that, and everything else is just collateral damage when the blast occurs?
Well, I like to step back. I'm an abstract type of person, so it's always good to be able to say, here's a principle that we're going to follow to find the risks. Because you could go through a checklist, but that checklist may have aged in 5 minutes from the different type of threat spaces. So that's why we don't have the graphic with us here, but I'm a proponent of the octave threat model, which being March, all you need to do is look at a March Madness Sweet 16 chart and invert it, and you have basically the octave threat model that talks about what your asset is. So obviously you need to go through and find what you really want to protect. But what I like about the octave threat models, it tells you network or physical. It tells you insider or outsider, accidental versus intentional, and then gives you specific outcomes to think about. And you can get your team together. And it's simple enough. You don't need technologists in that. You can say, if this is the asset we're looking at, and here's a pathway to the tree, you can help them. And this is my thesis overall with Octave. You need the business unit representatives as well as owners looking at what the outcomes are. Like, if I lose this data for a certain amount of time, if it's altered, think of someone altering your grades and changing, you're changing balances. Yeah. So altered, or if it's unavailable for me, how do I continue my business? They can make those sort of business impact decisions, even though you may have seen several as a cybersecurity professional. You need to have this sort of team mentality. And what's nice about the Octave approach is that it doesn't require them to study too in depth.
No technology needed. Just think about your day-to-day operation.
Yeah, it's agnostic. But when you also think about this fusion of physical safety and cyber threats, there are threat tree is about physical problems, hard drives failing, software needing updated, and all those fit in to help your end users see the program you're trying to lay out isn't necessarily, hey, we need to be a compliance. That's one type of risk. Then there's the other type of risk, like what's unknown. So the open-ended approach is what I prefer, because each business or each operating environment, if you want to call it, has things that are particular that the users or your people participating in that group will know. This is particularly key if you're consulting and you're moving between different types of operating environments. You can't say everything's going to look the same. You do need to customize a little bit, but you need a framework.
Yep.
And that's what's key. So you think about finding risk, and it's not just you seeing a lot. It's everybody has a picture. You just need to get the right amount of people on that team or the right people on that assessment group. So oftentimes people will do, like with you, John, they'll bring in experts who guide them through what they know about their environment. But then ideally, you're going to point out, use this methodology, you can see the next risk when I'm not here.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've found as I've helped customers develop a risk strategy for the risk that they have is to take current events. I mean, and if I didn't work with anybody during the Caesar's Palace and MGM events, but incidents, if I had, I certainly would have brought them right up. But I was helping one customer with their disaster recovery planning when a tornado came through in Western Kentucky and just obliterated a town. And I said, what happens if the data center just gets blown off the map? What are you guys going to do? And they didn't have a plan for it. So, taking that strategy of utilizing a recent event, because people are very experiential. Whatever their experience was most recently is what they're going to remember. And using that to help them think about the risk to their environment, I've found to be a successful strategy. But I do like the idea of taking my March Madness bracket, flipping it a little bit, and putting the asset I'm trying to protect in the middle and make the determination from there. I think that's, like you said, the octave model is a good one. And
what's convenient about that from the cybersecurity practitioner standpoint is that you can recommend particular control and you can say, here's where it breaks the tree.
Yeah.
We had some discussions about zero trust. That means that I'm going to re-authenticate or reestablish or evaluate that process. And you can point a particular part of that tree, whether it hits the threat, it hits the actor, it hits the motive, and you can help someone understand why that control is there. And then our job as the cybersecurity team is to judge whether that's effective or not.
Yeah.
Maybe it's only 80% effective on preventing that, because who does network access control anymore? Especially if you're mostly in your cloud access.
NAC is really hard to do.
Yeah, it's really hard to do. I've seen universities try to do that, and imagine mom and dad are here, they're dropping off their child to undergo a career of education, and they can't get on the network.
So as we move to our next topic, leveraging technology and human expertise to mitigate emerging threats, have you found, you mentioned zero trust very quickly, and I've been talking about zero trust since October of 2021. I wrote a little blog post and it spawned off a talk that I gave like 6 times in 2022 and 3 times in 2023. So what is your take on some technologies that can help address risk in the cybersecurity realm?
Well, just looking back at the higher education space, there are so many different types of identities. And
yes, identity. In my mind, start with identity, but go on.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of identities and roles, and that's one realm. Like when you leave, your identity persists. I thought that was unusual, but I realized that if it helps them connect, as I mentioned, development, I mentioned alumni and donors, they keep their alumni accounts. And sometimes not an alumni, you just went to school there for a while. They'll keep your account open, and that's ripe for abuse. So I think part of that identity problem is looming large in the education space, higher education in particular. I don't know if the K through 12 actually has that similar problem. But other items, the reason why I brought up zero trust, we were talking about it this morning. But the key piece is there a trend for can I manage my accounts online in some more concerted way. And there are some would say a government digital ID
Yeah.
would be good. And I'm looking at it and like, there's so many places where that's not feasible, meaning I don't have an infrastructure that's trusted. And I think part of what's good about the philosophy of zero trust is like, you have to build connections and build relationships, and you won't trust something like we did what we call transitive trust.
Yes.
You get a PGP key. I sign your PGP key. That means Tom Siu said John's key is this it, but a break in that somehow needs to have a deconstruction and a rebuilding of that trust. And I think that's what we're seeing is not happening well. The reason why I bring that up is I've advised a lot of customers who've had clients who've had identity theft or had their accounts stolen.
Oh, yeah.
Or someone breaking into their accounts. SIM swapping is a thing, and it's you see it in the news, and I tell you, yes, we see that happening pretty regularly. And there are ways that you can bolster your own ID. But if I can go create an ID online, how do I link that with an employer? How do I link that with a government agency? And how is the trust connected? It still rests upon you. I sometimes wish I was Amish.
So that you didn't have any technology.
But I mean, there are still risks that, they're dealing with farms. And, in our area, there are a lot of farmish, a lot of Amish buggies in the neighborhood. So the cycle here, though, is there are risks in all these. They permeate each one. Our jobs are to see how to help this particular business unit deal with the new threats. And you mentioned something earlier, current events. I think that's part of your job in identifying risks is to say, hey, this other organization had this issue. How does that apply to our situation here?
Oh, yes.
What can we learn from that? So as opposed to always chasing down your compliance activity. Hey, we met level 5 of our compliance activity.
Compliance does not equal security.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. In each of those different publications, I think it's really good that people do share the root cause or their post analysis. MGM was very helpful for me to see these cases and use it to explain to people. I'm very cautious not to use fear language.
Right.
That's one way you can pretty much get someone locked in on that particular case because they're afraid of that one thing.
Right.
You don't want to be afraid of everything, but you don't want to be trusting of everything.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too. I've had an experience very recently where, over the weekend actually, the Change Healthcare attack, where Change Healthcare, a subsidiary of United Healthcare, was compromised, and they're still down. They're still dealing with their ransomware event. And my understanding is they did even pay for the decryption key, but anyways, the threat actor that actually stole it, the criminal gang that actually stole the information, wasn't paid. So Alf V and Black Cat took the money and ran. So it was interesting. I had an account at an HSA providing organization. Over the weekend, I just happened to be logged into my email account and got here's the link to reset your password for this portal. And I was like, that was not me. And I'm like, who's just harvested a bunch of credentials for healthcare information? So I contacted the organization that provided the HSA card, and I hadn't used it since 2021. And I was like, okay. And there was no money on the card, thankfully, but I could see that is going to be a big problem for every healthcare organization that had data with Change Health. That's another cybersecurity risk where you have to think about the impacts of your third parties, which is a completely separate topic. And we have one more topic that I'm going to try and get to. The evolving role of the CISO in driving organizational resilience and security excellence. Wonderful words. Tell me what you think about those.
Well, first thing is, if you take the NIST cybersecurity framework of the different 5 categories, the far right is recovery.
Yes.
If that's not in the CISO's book of business, so to speak, it ought to be.
Oh, yeah.
And I use the word ought to be because it isn't always. Sometimes it's in some other departments.
Oh, yeah. IT operations usually is the recovery group.
Yeah. Or not. There are people who say, yeah, I've done my backup recovery mechanisms, but have you actually tied it into an operational capability.
Have you tested them? Beyond tying it in, I'm just like, did you test those backups recently?
Right. Or are they air gapped because the ransomware operators have figured out if they can hang out long enough, they can get into your backups and take those away, and you're negotiated yourself into their decision pool that you're gonna pay them. And so I would posit that if you can, I'm old enough to go back and like, if I know this when I was young, what I have done, and I would say part of if you're working out a cybersecurity program for a client or your own organization, and you're the CISO, sometimes you go like, what's my incident response program? What's my risk management program? Have I got those basically? And I would suggest that maybe you should think disaster recovery business continuity first, so that what programs you have feed into that. Because I've seen this for the past few years, mostly because I got involved in operational, physical, and emergency operations things that said, hey, and have an event, your IT event, then a number of those become a security incident.
Yes.
And those security incidents can blow up like ransomware. Are you triaging? Are you trying to contain it? But what if it doesn't? It becomes a disaster recovery planning. And that involves more than just your cybersecurity team, your IT teams, your operations teams, your applications teams. And if you haven't laid down protocols for who's deciding, who's on the call, otherwise you get 800 people on a phone call and they're all talking at the same time. Been there, done that. So
that's a big phone call.
That's a big phone call. Sometimes but there are mechanisms. FEMA has posted these mechanisms, the National Incident Management System. They're aimed at, I have a fire, but there are 4 different jurisdictions. Who's the on-scene commander? Who's the implement commander? What are the frameworks for who's doing logistics? Who's doing safety? Who's doing communications? All those things could be a role that you shift and train to in the IT space as well as the cybersecurity space. Hence, an IT incident, the data center went down.
Yep.
Could be sourced in a cybersecurity case or might not, but you need to be there so that you can use similar language on who's in charge, what are cycles, especially when they run over days, months time frame. And then part of that rolls into the emergency operations center. Let's say that someone's life is at risk, or you have this sort of fusion, and a fusion of the two. And the example I bring up is in October 7th in Israel.
Yeah.
I don't know if they were actual, bystanders who were attacking the emergency notification systems in Israel, or was actually Hamas operators doing that. But they were taking those things offline so people wouldn't be alerted that there was, an attack going on easily through the mass notification systems. And those were offline for a while, or even trying to prevent people from saying, hey, you need to go to your bomb shelters while they're launching rockets. So there are operational impacts of those. Who would have thought, nobody knew what kamikazes were in World War II at the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, and it's a holistic view that the CISO, I would say a well-trained CISO would have in terms of saying, look, I can address the cybersecurity or the security or the IT components of this, but a business continuity plan involves the entire business.
Right.
Recovery involves the entire business. People have to have a playbook to go by if the technology goes down. So yeah, you definitely have to have, and I hope that this, the chief information security officer, we mentioned this just before we went live. Typically they have the title of chief information security officer, but they're neither a chief nor an officer because they get overridden. Whereas if you go to the CFO and say, I want to buy this, and the CFO says no, the CFO gets to win that vote in a sense. It's not a democracy. The CFO can say no. The CISO frequently gets overridden by some other business, maybe it's the CEO, maybe it's the business development person who says, we got to have this, otherwise we're going to lose customers. The issue of elevating the position of CISO to an integral part of the leadership team is a critical component. And I'm hoping that more of that will happen in the years ahead. And we're getting close to our time. I'll let you make a comment, but we're getting close to our time. But your thoughts?
Okay. Well, thanks for the reins on there. The key piece is that the CFO is not going to be running an operational incident.
Oh, right. Sure.
So part of that is how you've tuned your attitude and your mentality to deal with crisis. And so you can point out, well, after you successfully dealt with the crisis, that we didn't have to have this crisis, because it's stressful for people, even if they're not participating, like, oh, my business is gone, those kind of things. How do you take that without, I told you so, but more of, I think we can avoid these things if we can agree on these. It's still very interesting that you need to be acting as if you're given that responsibility, wearing the hat as if you're responsible, but also regarding that there's time to say no because I've not been given that decision authority, and that it's a whole new way of looking at the work that's available. I think it's harder for CISOs now. There are more things hitting them from a regulatory standpoint, especially in the public sector, that make it harder to negotiate. But you still have to. I think organizations that do value the contribution you provide as a CISO should recognize that.
Agreed. Well, this half hour went by very quickly. I appreciate your time here, Tom. There we go. And good luck in your new position. And I'm sure we'll stay in touch. Thanks again for your coming on board today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure joining you. I appreciate your time.
You got it. Take care. Take it away, Lance.
Thanks, guys.